Hello. So today I want to talk about Pericles' funeral oration, and a little bit about its context, as well as what it has to say about some of our earliest advocates for democracy. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that even though ancient Athens was a democratic state, and the majority of the people there did seem to support democratic government, we actually have very few pro-democracy writings that survive from the ancient Athenian polis. So this is a little bit unusual. The famous philosophers from Athens whose work did get recorded on politics actually tended to be critical of democracy. And we'll be talking about some of them later on in this course as well. One of the few pro-democracy arguments that has been preserved is what we call Pericles' funeral oration. And even this we don't have an original version of. What we have is a copy of it in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. So a historian writing after the fact tried to go back and record the content of this famous political speech. So what is Pericles' funeral oration? Well, Athens at this time is engaged in what we call the Peloponnesian War, which is a war between Athens and Sparta that is fought during the later part of the 5th century BCE. Pericles' funeral oration, we think, was given around 430 BCE in Athens. And what it is, again, a funeral oration. It's a eulogy that Pericles, who was a prominent Athenian political leader at the time, is asked to give a speech at a sort of group memorial service for soldiers who had died fighting in this Peloponnesian War. And so it really is a speech at a funeral. And of course, Pericles begins this speech by talking about the people who've died, not so much as individuals, right, but in terms of their courage and their bravery and their loyalty and all of this. But then, being a politician, he decides to also use this speech for a bit of a political turn. And he starts talking about why the cause they died fighting for is worth fighting for. Why Athens is special. Why the Athenian form of government, right, which is a democracy compared to Sparta, which isn't, is a superior form of government, and why it is worth these people giving their lives to defend Athens. And so the majority of the speech and the most famous parts of the speech aren't really about the people who are being memorialized so much as they're about Athens and Athens' government in general. So, all of that as background, what does Pericles actually have to say in terms of why Athens is special and why democratic government is a good thing? And there are three main points that I want to talk about here. The first is that even though Athens is not what we would today call a liberal democracy, that combines democratic values with sort of classical liberal values, they don't have sort of the full, Bill of Rights type protections. They did have a respect for individual liberty, including some respect for freedom of speech and differences of opinion that, by the standards of the ancient world, was quite freedom-loving, right? Quite respectful of liberty. And this is something that Pericles talks about. This is also something that comes up in the Crito, when Socrates talks about the fact that any place else he moved, he would just be arrested and executed sooner than he had been in Athens. because Athens was about the most freedom-loving city in the ancient Mediterranean. And so they talk about this. They specifically talk about the fact that you can criticize people in positions of power. You can criticize political decisions in Athens. That is seen as part of being your rights as a democratic citizen, which again, in an authoritarian system, in a traditional monarchy, is not often the case. So he talks about liberty, again, specifically in the context of speech and criticism. He also talks about social mobility. Now, Athens still had a huge amount of social inequality and wealth inequality, right? There are very, very rich people. There are very, very poor people in Athens. There are also a very large number of enslaved people in Athens that Pericles conveniently kind of skips over. So there are huge wealth disparities. What you didn't have, though, in Athens was sort of a set class structure, where if you were born into a certain level of society, there was no way, no matter how successful you were, to actually change to another level. The sort of thing that you see in societies where there is a formal aristocracy and or a formal royal family, right, that you're either in or you're not. In Athens, while you do have huge wealth disparities, you don't have classes that are set in stone like that. Right? So a person who is born poor, if they are hardworking and if they are lucky, and they become rich, then they are rich. It's not, well, if you're born a serf, no matter how successful you are, you will always be a serf. And this is something that Pericles praises about Athens. Now, Pericles himself was very wealthy, but a majority of his political supporters were among the poorer people in Athens. And so this idea that where you were born was not the sole decider of your fate was really important to Pericles and to a lot of Athenians. Now, thirdly and lastly, oh, we have a kitty cameo. Okay, good girl. This is Honey. Yes. Okay, so third and lastly, we have Pericles' argument that citizens in a democracy feel more loyalty to their state and feel a greater sense of attachment and are therefore willing to fight harder to protect their state than soldiers in an authoritarian system would be. That when the people have a say in the making of laws, that they will feel a sense of attachment to those laws and a sense of loyalty to those laws, beyond just agreeing with them, right, or disagreeing with them, but that if you had a hand in the process, right, you will then feel a greater moral obligation to follow those rules, to protect that system. Because you have a hand in it, right? And some of it is this sort of psychological, right? You have a say in the process, therefore you feel personally tied to the outcome. Some of it, I think, is a more self-interested motive, where, for example, he sort of says, if you're under one authoritarian regime and you are under threat from another authoritarian regime, to the average common person, that's sort of a lateral move, right? I'm under this dictator or I'm under that dictator. Where if you're under democracy, where you have political rights, and you have a say in your system of government, and that is then under threat from an outside authoritarian regime, that you will have more motivation to fight to protect those rights and to protect that democratic government. And so this is why Pericles argues that soldiers in Athens will fight harder and be more motivated to protect their city than they otherwise would, right? That Athens is special because Athens is a democracy. and the people therefore have these rights and have this attachment to the government, right? The government isn't them up there, the government is us. And this is something we can talk about a little bit more later on. So, I hope that makes sense to you. So long.